History books tell us World War II was won on the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Britain, and in the frozen streets of Stalingrad. But what if I told you there was another battlefield, one that rarely makes the headlines? A land thousands of miles away, where millions of forgotten men and women carried the weight of the war on their backs. They were not hailed as heroes. Their names do not echo in classrooms. Yet without them, Hitler might have won. From the scorching sands of North Africa to the hidden mines of the Congo, this is the untold story of how Africa helped win the Second World War, and how the world tried to bury that truth. When Hitler's armies swept across Europe in 1940, their eyes turned south, toward Africa. North Africa was more than desert, it was the gateway to the Middle East, to the oil fields that could fuel the Nazi war machine. If Hitler could capture the Suez Canal, Britain's empire would choke, and the Allies might collapse. And so Africa, a continent colonized and divided, suddenly became a chessboard in the world's deadliest game. In the vast deserts of Libya and Egypt, German tanks clashed with Allied forces. Dust storms rose like walls of fire as the legendary Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, swept across the sands with brutal speed. But what most people don't know is this: standing against Rommel's mighty panzers were not just British or American soldiers, but Africans. Nigerians, Kenyans, Sudanese, Moroccans, Algerians. Men pulled from colonies, many barely trained, thrown into battles that would decide the fate of the world. Imagine it. Young farmers who had never seen a tank, forced into a desert inferno, ordered to hold the line against Hitler's most feared general. Some fought with courage. Some fell in silence. And yet their blood bought time for the Allies. Time to regroup, time to strike back at El Alamein, where the tide of the war would begin to turn. Africa was no longer in the shadows. It had become the battleground that Hitler could not conquer. And that history would try to forget. As the war escalated, Africa became more than a battleground. It became a reservoir of manpower. France, Britain, Belgium, and Portugal began drafting millions of Africans into their armies. They were told they were fighting for freedom, for civilization, for a better world. But the reality is that many were dragged from their villages against their will. Chiefs were threatened, families torn apart, young men marched away in chains of duty they never chose. The numbers are staggering. Over 2 million Africans served in World War II. From the jungles of Congo to the plains of Nigeria, men were forced into uniforms, given rifles, and sent thousands of miles to fight wars they barely understood. The Senegalese tirailleurs, fierce riflemen from West Africa, became a symbol of France's colonial might. Nigerians, Kenyans, Ghanaians, and Somalis filled the ranks of Britain's regiments. Ethiopians and Eritreans, who had tasted Mussolini's fascist brutality firsthand, joined the fight with vengeance in their hearts. But here's the controversy: while European soldiers fought for their homelands, Africans were fighting for empires that had enslaved them. Many were promised freedom and equality after the war. Many believed the blood they shed would buy their nation's independence. The irony is haunting. Africans were told they were fighting against tyranny abroad, while living under tyranny at home. And yet, they marched. They fought. They died. For a freedom that was not theirs, not yet. By 1941, Hitler's most feared commander, General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was sweeping across North Africa. His tanks carved through Allied defenses like blades of fire through dry grass. The world held its breath. If Rommel reached the Suez Canal, Britain's empire could collapse. The Nazis would gain control of vital oil fields. The war might have been lost. This was the moment Africa's soldiers became more than footnotes. At El Alamein, a dusty railway stop in the Egyptian desert, tens of thousands of Africans were thrown into the fight. Sudanese machine gunners, Nigerian artillery units, Moroccan infantry, all facing one of the most brilliant generals of the war. The desert was unforgiving. Scorching days. Freezing nights. Sand that blinded the eyes and clogged the weapons. Yet these men, many without boots, sometimes with barely enough food, stood against Rommel's tanks. And when the tide turned, when General Montgomery's counterattack broke through at El Alamein, African soldiers were at the front lines of victory. Winston Churchill would later call it the end of the beginning. But he never mentioned the Africans who bled in that desert. Without their stand, Hitler might have seized Africa, the Middle East, and changed the course of history forever. But the world forgot their names. The books erased their courage. And the silence became deeper than the sands of the Sahara. There is a secret buried in the mines of the Congo. A secret that ended the war, and changed human history forever. Deep in the Belgian Congo, in a mine called Shinkalabwe, lay the purest uranium in the world. Unknown to the miners who dug it with their bare hands, this uranium would become the fuel for the most destructive weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. When the United States began the Manhattan Project, they quietly turned to Belgium's colonial governor. Shipments of Congolese uranium were smuggled out under heavy guard, across the Atlantic, into secret laboratories. And in 1945, when the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned with unnatural fire, that uranium came from Africa. Think about that. African soil ended the war in Japan. African miners, who lived in poverty, under colonial brutality, unknowingly supplied the weapon that forced Japan's surrender. Yet, not a single history book tells their names. The world remembers Oppenheimer. The world remembers Truman. But it does not remember the nameless men who dug in darkness, whose sweat powered the dawn of the nuclear age. And that silence is not an accident. It is the deliberate erasure of Africa's hand in shaping the fate of the world. Africa's role in the war was not just soldiers. It was resources. Rubber from Liberia, copper from Zambia, gold from South Africa, cocoa from Ghana, groundnuts from Nigeria. The continent was plundered to keep the Allied war machine alive. Factories in Europe ran on African minerals. Allied armies marched in African boots. Their planes flew with African rubber in the tires. Their radios buzzed with African copper in the wires. But for the people of Africa, there was no reward. Instead, the war brought hunger. Crops were seized to feed European troops. Villages starved while ships full of African grain sailed to London. In Senegal, peasants were forced to grow peanuts instead of food. In Mozambique, families were beaten if they failed to meet cotton quotas. In Kenya, farmers watched as their cattle were taken for the British Army. It was a war fought with African blood, African sweat, African soil. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the empires that had drained Africa dry had no intention of saying thank you. They simply turned the page, leaving scars that still bleed today. For many Africans, the war was not just about defeating Hitler. It was about hope. Colonial soldiers believed the promises whispered to them by recruiters: fight for us, and you will be free. Serve with honor, and independence will follow. Men like Amilcar Cabral, Patrice Lumumba, Jomo Kenyatta, and Kwame Nkrumah would later say the war opened their eyes. They saw Europe bleed. They saw that the empires were not invincible. And they believed Africa's time had come. But when the war ended, those promises were shattered. African veterans returned home with medals on their chests, only to be treated as second-class citizens once again. Many were denied pensions. Many were beaten if they demanded equality. In Senegal in 1944, African veterans protesting unpaid wages at the Thiaroye camp were massacred by French troops, men who had fought side by side with them just months earlier. The betrayal was complete. Africans had shed blood to defeat fascism, only to return to the chains of colonialism. But something had changed. The war had planted a seed, a burning fire that would ignite the independence movements of the 1950s and 60s. The broken promises of World War II did not kill hope. They fed it. And the next battle would not be fought for Europe. It would be fought for Africa. But not all Africans went quietly to war under colonial banners. Some resisted. Some rebelled. In Madagascar, the Malagasy people, forced into war labor, began to rise in anger. In Kenya, whispers of rebellion spread through villages as men refused conscription, hiding in forests to escape British recruiters. In Nigeria, strikes erupted among dockworkers, furious that their labor was being stolen for a war that was not theirs. And there were darker forms of resistance. Sabotage. Desertion. Soldiers who deliberately refused orders, or who deserted colonial armies to return home. To the empires, this was treason. To Africans, it was survival. And though these rebellions were often crushed, violently, mercilessly, they revealed something Europe had long ignored: Africa was not a silent pawn. Africa was thinking, resisting, fighting back in ways both visible and hidden. This resistance planted roots. The same men who resisted during the war would become the backbone of nationalist movements after it. The seeds of rebellion were already in the soil, watered by blood and betrayal. World War II is remembered for Nazi concentration camps, for Hiroshima, for the Blitz. But what of Africa? What of the atrocities hidden under colonial silence? In Algeria, French forces used brutal conscription methods, dragging men from their villages by force. In Ethiopia, civilians suffered starvation and reprisals during the East African Campaign. And then came Thiaroye, 1944. Hundreds of Senegalese tirailleurs, African soldiers who had fought for France, gathered peacefully, asking for their unpaid wages. The response was that French troops opened fire on their own men. Bodies fell in the dust, their medals stained with blood. This massacre was not taught in French schools. It was buried, erased, a shameful stain that did not fit the heroic narrative of liberation. In the Belgian Congo, forced labor under wartime quotas killed thousands. In Mozambique, families were tortured for failing to deliver cotton. In South Africa, black soldiers were often denied weapons, forced into labor battalions while whites took the glory. And through it all, propaganda painted the war as a noble fight for freedom. But for millions of Africans, it was a new form of bondage. A war fought for masters who saw them as expendable. These atrocities reveal a truth that history books seldom admit. For Africa, World War II was not just a global struggle against fascism. It was a continuation of colonial violence, dressed in the language of liberty. But history has a strange way of turning oppression into fire. When African soldiers returned home, they carried more than scars. They carried stories. They had marched in Paris. They had seen London. They had fought in Burma, Italy, and North Africa. And they had looked into the eyes of Europeans. Men who bled, men who died, men who were not gods. They had seen empires shaken. And they began to ask, if Europe could fall, why not colonialism? This was the awakening. The war became the forge that shaped Africa's new leaders. Men like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who studied in America during the war and returned determined to free his people. Men like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, who saw the hypocrisy of fighting Hitler abroad while enforcing tyranny at home. Men like Amilcar Cabral, who later said that the war opened his generation's eyes to the fragility of empire. For the first time, Africans realized they had leverage. They had fought. They had sacrificed. And now, they demanded freedom. The stage was set. The empires thought the war had saved them. But in truth, it had doomed them. For out of the ashes of World War II, a new Africa was rising. One that would no longer bow. One that would no longer be silent. The guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Cities reduced to ash. Empires, once untouchable, shaken to their core. But what about Africa? Africa had changed forever. The continent had sent more than 1 million soldiers into battlefields around the world. Its mines had fueled the war. Its farms had fed armies. Its blood had paid for a war that was never truly its own. And yet, out of that sacrifice came transformation. France, weakened and humiliated, would soon face uprisings in Algeria, Madagascar, and West Africa. Britain, bankrupted and exhausted, watched as independence movements grew too strong to suppress. Portugal and Belgium clung desperately to their colonies, but the tide of history was against them. The war had stripped the myth of European invincibility. African veterans returned home not as servants but as men who had fought and bled in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. They asked, if we can fight Hitler, why not fight colonialism? And the answer came in the decades that followed. In the cries of Uhuru across East Africa. In the roar of independence speeches in Accra. In the thunder of freedom songs that shook apartheid's walls. The war that had begun as a struggle between empires ended as the beginning of the end for empire itself. This is the untold legacy of Africa in World War II. Not just as a backdrop, not just as laborers and soldiers, but as the silent engine of victory, and the spark that ignited Africa's own liberation. History remembers the victors. It remembers Churchill's speeches, Roosevelt's resolve, Stalin's iron fist. But it too often forgets the African soldier who froze in the Italian mountains, the Congolese miner who dug uranium under brutal conditions, the Senegalese veteran left unpaid, betrayed, and buried without honor. Africa helped win World War II. But the world did not honor Africa. And yet, Africa remembered itself. The war opened eyes, hardened resolve, and planted the seeds of independence. So the next time you hear the story of World War II, remember this truth. Without Africa, the war might have dragged on, or been lost entirely. Africa was not a footnote. Africa was the turning point. And though the world may forget, the continent will never forget. Because in the deserts of North Africa, in the jungles of Burma, in the mines of the Congo, and in the hearts of millions of Africans, a new world was born. A world that whispered, then shouted, then declared with unshakable certainty, Africa will be free. History forgot Africa's sacrifice, but you don't have to. If this story moved you, honor those forgotten heroes by sharing it, leaving your thoughts below, and keeping their memory alive. The world celebrated victory. But Africa paid the price. Let's make sure their voices are never silenced again. Subscribe for more untold stories, because history only lives when we remember.